He invited her to dinner to remind her she was nothing without him. The restaurant smelled of aged oak and expensive wine, the kind that lingered in the air long after the glass was empty, and Clara Whitmore felt it settle into her lungs as she stepped inside, heels soft against polished marble, every step measured, every breath controlled, because she already knew this wasn't just dinner, it was a stage, and she had been cast without her consent. The hostess greeted her with a smile too practiced to be genuine, leading her past candlelit tables and low murmurs of wealth into a private dining room tucked behind heavy velvet curtains, where the lighting dimmed just enough to flatter the powerful and expose the vulnerable, and there he was, Daniel Hayes, exactly where he wanted to be, seated at the center of the table like a man who still believed the world revolved around him, his hand draped casually over the back of his chair, his laugh already mid-performance as if the night had been rehearsed. Clara paused for half a second at the threshold, just long enough for the past to brush against her skin like a ghost she no longer feared, then she stepped in, shoulders straight, expression calm, the faintest trace of a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, because she had learned, slowly and painfully, that silence could be louder than any defense. "Clara," Daniel said, his voice warm in a way that felt rehearsed, rising just slightly as though announcing her arrival to the room, "I wasn't sure you'd come." Of course he was sure. He had counted on it. She could see it in the way the others turned to look at her, curious, assessing, already forming quiet judgments behind polite smiles, men in tailored suits, women draped in silk and diamonds, all of them witnesses to something they didn't yet understand. "You said it was important," Clara replied, her tone even, slipping into her seat with controlled grace, her fingers brushing the edge of the tablecloth, feeling the fine linen beneath her skin as if anchoring herself to the present. Daniel chuckled softly, exchanging a glance with the woman beside him, a brunette with glossy hair and a confidence sharpened by proximity to power, the kind of confidence Clara remembered wearing once, back when she still believed proximity meant belonging. "Important might be a strong word," he said, swirling the amber liquid in his glass, watching it catch the light, "but I thought it would be nice for everyone to see how you're doing." The words landed gently, almost politely, but there was an edge beneath them, something deliberate, something designed, and Clara felt it, not as a wound, but as a familiar pattern, the same rhythm he had used for years, the subtle undermining disguised as concern, the quiet dismantling wrapped in charm. Around the table, a few smiles tightened, a few eyes flickered between them, sensing the shift, the tension threading through the room like a current just beneath the surface, and Clara simply nodded, her gaze steady, her posture unshaken, because she understood now what he was trying to do, and more importantly, she understood something he didn't. She wasn't here to defend herself. She was here to watch him finish what he started. Her fingers rested lightly against the stem of her glass, unmoving, her pulse slow and steady, her expression unreadable, and for the first time that night, something flickered in Daniel's eyes, not doubt, not yet, but the faintest crack in his certainty, because Clara Whitmore wasn't reacting the way she used to. And he had no idea why. The first course arrived with a quiet precision that felt almost ceremonial, porcelain plates set down without a sound, silverware aligned as if even the smallest detail mattered, and Clara noticed how the room leaned back into its rhythm, conversations resuming in low, measured tones, as though nothing unusual had happened, as though Daniel had not just drawn a line in the air and placed her on the weaker side of it, but he had, and he was not finished. "So," he said, leaning back in his chair with an ease that bordered on careless, though his eyes remained fixed on her, sharp, assessing, "I heard you are still working at that little consulting firm." The word little lingered, stretched just enough to be felt, and a few people at the table exchanged subtle glances, the kind that pretended not to notice but noticed everything. Clara lifted her glass, the stem cool against her fingers, her movements unhurried, deliberate, as if time belonged to her now. "It keeps me busy," she replied, her voice calm, steady, giving him nothing more than the surface. Daniel smiled, but it did not reach his eyes. "Busy is good," he said, nodding as if he approved, as if his approval still held weight, "though I always thought you would aim for something bigger." He gestured lightly around the room, the soft glow of chandeliers reflecting off crystal and polished wood, a silent comparison woven into the air. "Something like this." The brunette beside him let out a soft laugh, not cruel, but aligned, reinforcing the tone, and Clara felt the faint shift of attention again, the room tightening around the exchange, waiting to see if she would defend herself, explain herself, justify the life he was so carefully diminishing. She did not. Instead, she placed her glass back down with a quiet precision and met his gaze, not with defiance, not with hurt, but with something far more unsettling, an absence of reaction that left his words suspended without impact. "I am exactly where I need to be," she said, and the simplicity of it seemed to confuse him, just slightly, just enough to register as a flicker beneath his practiced composure. He leaned forward then, elbows brushing the edge of the table, his tone lowering as though shifting into something more personal, more intimate, though it was anything but. "And alone?" he asked, tilting his head, feigning curiosity, "that does not get lonely?" The question landed sharper than the others, not because of what it implied, but because of how intentionally it was delivered, designed to expose, to provoke, to remind her of what he believed she lacked. Around them, the room quieted again, forks pausing midair, conversation stalling just enough to listen without appearing to listen, and Clara felt the weight of it, the expectation, the invisible pressure to respond in a way that would satisfy the narrative he was building. She could almost see it forming, the image of the woman who had been left behind, who had settled for less, who had faded quietly out of the life he had outgrown. Her fingers rested lightly against the table, her posture unchanged, her breathing even, and for a moment, she let the silence stretch, long enough to become noticeable, long enough to shift the discomfort back toward him. Then, softly, almost gently, she said, "You always assumed you were the center of everything, Daniel." It was not an accusation. It was a statement, delivered without heat, without bitterness. And somehow that made it heavier. His smile tightened, just a fraction, his confidence recalibrating as he searched for his footing again, because this was not the reaction he expected, not the unraveling he had planned for. Clara glanced down briefly at her wrist, at the simple watch resting there, its face catching the candlelight, and then back up at him, her expression unchanged, her voice calm. "You should finish what you started." The words were quiet, almost polite, but they carried something beneath them, something deliberate, something that did not belong to the past he thought he understood, and for the first time that evening, Daniel hesitated, just for a second, just long enough for the room to feel it, though he did not yet know why. The pause lingered just long enough to become uncomfortable, the kind of silence that does not belong in a room designed for power and conversation, and then it broke, not with a voice, but with the soft shift of attention as the door to the private dining room opened, quiet and unannounced, yet somehow impossible to ignore, and Clara did not turn immediately, she did not need to, because she felt it, the subtle change in the air, the way the staff near the entrance straightened, the way the manager himself appeared almost instantly, his posture sharpening, his tone lowering into something respectful, almost careful, and only then did she lift her gaze, just slightly, as if acknowledging something she had been expecting all along. Daniel followed the movement a second too late, his eyes flicking toward the door with mild irritation, as though the interruption offended him, but that irritation faltered, cracked, and then vanished entirely as recognition set in, not loudly, not dramatically, but in the quiet way a man realizes he has misread the room entirely. The man who stepped inside did not rush, did not announce himself, his presence unfolding with a calm authority that did not need volume to be felt, his suit perfectly tailored, his expression composed, his eyes scanning the room with a focus that settled, without hesitation, on Clara. Alexander Reed did not belong to the noise of the evening, he belonged to the silence that followed it, and as he moved forward, the subtle choreography of the restaurant adjusted around him, a chair shifted, a path cleared, the manager murmuring something under his breath that sounded very much like deference. Clara's fingers relaxed slightly against the table, the tension she had held so carefully dissolving not into relief, but into something steadier, something grounded, and when Alexander reached her side, he did not look at anyone else first, he did not acknowledge the table, the audience, or the man who had been speaking only moments before, he looked at her. "I am sorry I am late," he said, his voice low, even, carrying just enough to be heard without ever needing to rise. The meeting ran longer than expected. There was no performance in it, no need to prove anything, and that alone shifted the balance of the room. Clara met his gaze, a faint, almost imperceptible warmth touching her expression, the first genuine change anyone had seen from her all evening. "You are right on time," she replied, and the words meant more than they appeared to. Only then did Alexander's attention move, slow and deliberate, to Daniel, who was no longer leaning back in his chair, no longer relaxed, his posture subtly adjusted as if trying to recover ground that had already been lost. "Daniel Hayes," Alexander said, not as a question, but as confirmation, his hand extending in a gesture that was polite, controlled, and impossible to refuse. Daniel stood, because he had to, because every instinct in him recognized the shift even if he did not want to accept it, and as their hands met, the contrast was immediate, one man reaching, the other already holding. "Alexander Reed," Daniel replied, his voice steady but thinner now, searching for footing, for control, for anything that would restore the version of the evening he thought he was leading. Alexander gave a single nod, then released his hand, turning his attention back to Clara as he took the seat beside her, as if that was the only position that mattered. "I trust everything has been pleasant," he said, the pause before the last word so slight it could almost be missed, but not by Daniel, not by anyone at the table, because in that pause lived the question no one else had asked. Clara did not rush to answer, she did not need to, her gaze steady, her voice calm. "It has been enlightening," she said, and that was enough. The manager reappeared at Alexander's side almost instantly, offering quiet updates, mentioning arrangements, names, details that made the structure of the evening suddenly visible in a different way, and Daniel heard it, heard enough to understand, piece by piece, that the dinner he had orchestrated, the room he believed he controlled, the deal he had been building toward, all of it rested on something he had not accounted for. Alexander listened briefly, then gave a small nod. "We will discuss the proposal another time," he said, not unkindly, but definitively, the kind of statement that closed doors without needing to slam them, and the meaning settled over the table with a finality no one could argue with. Daniel opened his mouth, perhaps to recover, to redirect, to reclaim something, but the words did not come, because there was nothing left to say that would not sound smaller than it had before. Clara did not look at him, not anymore, she did not need to, her posture unchanged, her presence quiet, complete, and in that moment, it became clear to everyone at the table that she had never been the one on display. She had been the one waiting. And now, there was nothing left for him to prove. The rhythm of the room did not return the way it had before, it shifted, subtly but irreversibly, conversations resuming with a careful distance as if everyone understood they were now part of something they had not been meant to witness, and Clara felt it in the way no one quite met her eyes the same way again, no longer with curiosity or quiet judgment, but with a new awareness, a recalibration of everything they thought they knew about her, and she did not acknowledge it, she simply reached for her glass, her movement smooth, unhurried, as if nothing about the evening had surprised her at all. Beside her, Alexander sat with an ease that did not demand attention yet commanded it effortlessly, his presence grounding the space without overshadowing it, and when the next course was served, he thanked the waiter by name, a small detail that did not go unnoticed, not by Clara, not by anyone, because it revealed something different from the kind of power that needed to be displayed, it revealed control without performance. Daniel remained standing for a fraction too long before lowering himself back into his chair, the movement lacking the confidence it had carried earlier, his fingers brushing against the edge of his glass as though searching for something to hold on to, his gaze flickering between Clara and Alexander, recalculating, reassessing, trying to piece together a narrative that no longer made sense. "I was not aware you two were," he began, the sentence trailing off as if even he did not know how to finish it without exposing the assumption behind it, and Clara turned her head slightly, meeting his eyes for the first time since Alexander had arrived, her expression calm, composed, almost kind, but not inviting. "There are many things you were not aware of," she said softly, and there was no accusation in it, no need for one, because the truth had already settled in the space between them. The brunette beside Daniel shifted in her seat, her earlier confidence dimmed into something quieter, more cautious, as if proximity to him no longer carried the same certainty it had before, and the others at the table followed suit, their attention redirecting, their engagement with him loosening in small, almost imperceptible ways that added up to something unmistakable. Alexander glanced briefly at Clara, not to check, not to question, but simply to be present, and then his gaze moved to Daniel again, steady, measured. "Your proposal was ambitious," he said, choosing the word carefully, allowing it to exist without judgment while still holding its weight, but ambition without clarity rarely leads to sustainable results. It was not a dismissal in tone, but it was one in meaning, and Daniel understood that, the realization settling into his posture, into the slight tightening of his jaw, into the silence that followed because there was no argument he could make that would not sound like justification. Clara watched him for a brief moment, not with satisfaction, not with triumph, but with a quiet recognition of something that had finally reached its end, the version of herself that had once needed his validation dissolving completely in the face of what she had become, and she felt no need to say more, no need to explain, because the room itself had already done that for her. The manager returned once more, offering a quiet update about arrangements for Alexander, mentioning a reservation adjustment, a private suite prepared upstairs, details that spoke of a level of consideration Daniel had not even known to request, and Clara noticed the way Daniel's shoulders shifted again, the subtle understanding that this evening had never belonged to him, not in the way he believed it did. She placed her napkin gently beside her plate, her posture unchanged, her movements precise, and then she turned slightly toward Alexander, her voice soft, steady. "Shall we?" she asked, and he nodded once, rising with her in a motion that felt seamless, natural, as though leaving was not an escape, but a continuation. No one stopped them, no one spoke, because there was nothing left to interrupt, and as Clara stepped away from the table, she did not look back, not at Daniel, not at the room, not at the version of her life that had once been defined by his presence, because she no longer needed to measure herself against it. The door closed behind them with a quiet finality, and inside the room, the silence that followed was heavier than anything that had been said, because for the first time, Daniel understood that he had not lost her in that moment. He had lost her long before. He had just been the last one to realize it. The hallway outside the private dining room felt different, quieter, the kind of quiet that was not empty but intentional, softened by thick carpeting and warm recessed lighting that cast a golden glow along the walls, and Clara felt her breath settle into a rhythm she had not realized she was holding, the tension unwinding not in a rush but in something slower, steadier, like a knot finally loosening after years of being pulled too tight. The faint clink of glassware and distant murmur of voices remained behind the closed door, muted now, irrelevant, as if that entire room had already begun to fade into something smaller than it once felt, and she paused for just a moment, her fingers brushing lightly against the strap of her bag, grounding herself in the present, in the reality she had built piece by piece without anyone's permission. Beside her, Alexander did not rush her, did not fill the silence with questions or commentary, he simply stood there, his presence calm, anchored, the kind of presence that did not need to be asserted to be felt, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried the same quiet steadiness that had shifted the entire room moments before. "You handled that exactly the way you needed to," he said, not as praise, not as surprise, but as recognition, as if he had always expected nothing less. Clara let out a small breath, almost a laugh, though there was no bitterness in it, only a trace of something lighter, something freed. "He thought I would defend myself," she said, her voice soft but clear, her eyes tracing the subtle patterns in the carpet for a second before lifting again. "He always thought that was the only way to exist in his world." Alexander studied her for a moment, not evaluating, not questioning, simply seeing, and there was a quiet understanding in his gaze that did not need to be explained. "And now?" he asked, the question open, without expectation. Clara tilted her head slightly, considering it, feeling the answer settle into place not as something new, but as something that had been forming long before tonight. "Now I do not need to," she replied, and the simplicity of it carried more weight than anything she could have said at that table. A member of the staff approached discreetly, offering to escort them to the private suite upstairs, but Alexander gave a polite nod and a quiet instruction to have the car brought around instead, his tone effortless, the kind that assumed compliance without demanding it, and within seconds, the arrangement was already in motion, another subtle shift that Clara noticed, not because she needed it, but because she recognized the difference between power that controlled and power that accommodated. They began to walk toward the exit, their steps unhurried, aligned, and Clara felt something unfamiliar settle in her chest, not relief exactly, but a sense of closure that did not come from confrontation or victory, but from the absence of need, the absence of anything left unresolved. As they reached the front of the restaurant, the night air greeted them, cool and crisp, carrying the faint scent of the city, distant traffic, and something cleaner, something open, and Clara inhaled deeply, the air filling her lungs in a way that felt almost new. The car was already waiting, the driver stepping forward to open the door with practiced precision, and as Clara moved toward it, she paused just slightly, her gaze drifting back toward the building for a brief second, not searching, not hoping, just acknowledging, the final glance at something that no longer held her. She did not see Daniel, she did not need to, because whatever he was doing, whatever he was thinking, it no longer intersected with her life in any meaningful way. Alexander's hand rested lightly at the small of her back, not guiding, not directing, simply present, and she stepped into the car, the interior warm, quiet, insulated from the outside world. As the door closed behind her and the car began to move, Clara leaned back against the seat, her fingers resting loosely in her lap, her reflection faintly visible in the window as the city lights blurred past, and for the first time that night, she allowed her eyes to close, just for a moment, not in exhaustion, but in recognition of something far more powerful. He had tried to remind her of who she used to be. But she had already become someone he could not reach. The city moved around them in a quiet blur of light and motion, reflections stretching across the car window like something fluid and untouchable, and Clara watched it without really seeing it, her mind not racing, not replaying the dinner the way it once would have, but settling instead into a stillness that felt unfamiliar in its absence of urgency, as if for the first time in a long time, there was nothing left she needed to fix, nothing left she needed to prove. The soft hum of the engine filled the space between her and Alexander, not uncomfortable, not heavy, just present, and when he finally spoke, his voice was low, measured, carrying the same quiet certainty that had followed him into the room earlier. "You knew he set that up," he said, not asking, simply placing the truth between them. Clara did not turn right away, her gaze still resting on the shifting lights outside, her reflection faintly layered over the city, a double image of who she had been and who she was now. "I did," she answered, her tone even, her fingers tracing an absent pattern against her palm, a habit she had not realized she still carried. Alexander nodded once, as if that confirmed something he had already understood. "And you went anyway?" This time, there was the slightest inflection, not doubt, not concern, but curiosity, the kind that comes from wanting to understand the decision, not question it. Clara exhaled slowly, the breath steady, controlled. Her shoulders relaxing against the seat as she finally turned her head just enough to meet his gaze. "For a long time, I thought closure meant saying everything I never said," she admitted, her voice softer now, not fragile, but reflective. "I thought I needed him to hear it, to understand what he did, to acknowledge it." She paused, just briefly, her eyes steady, clear. But tonight was not about him understanding anything. The words settled into the quiet space between them, and Alexander did not interrupt, did not rush her, allowing the thought to unfold fully. "It was about me seeing that I do not need him to," she continued, and there was no weight to it, no lingering resentment, just clarity, the kind that arrives only after something has fully ended. The car slowed slightly as it approached an intersection, the glow of a red light casting a soft wash of color across the interior, and Clara watched it shift across Alexander's features, the sharp lines of his profile softened for a moment before the light changed again. "You did not say much in there," he observed, his tone neutral, though there was a hint of something else beneath it, something quieter, almost thoughtful. Clara allowed herself the faintest smile, not directed at him, but at the memory of it, at the realization of how different it felt this time. "I used to think silence meant losing," she said, her voice steady, like if I did not defend myself, then whatever he said would become the truth. She glanced down at her hands, resting loosely in her lap, no tension, no tightness, just stillness. "But silence can also mean you are no longer part of the argument." Alexander studied her for a moment, and then he gave a small nod, the kind that did not exaggerate agreement, but acknowledged it fully. "That is a difficult thing to learn," he said, and there was no condescension in it, only recognition. The car began to move again, the city unfolding ahead of them, and Clara leaned back slightly, her gaze lifting once more to the passing lights, but this time they did not blur together, they felt distinct, separate, as if she was finally seeing things as they were instead of through the lens of what they used to mean. "He thought tonight would remind me of my place," she said quietly, almost to herself, and then, after a brief pause, she added, "He just did not realize that place no longer exists." The words lingered in the air, not heavy, not sharp, just final, and as the car continued through the city, carrying them farther from the restaurant, from the past, from everything that had once defined her, Clara did not look back, not even in her thoughts, because for the first time, there was nothing behind her that needed revisiting. The car slowed to a gentle stop beneath the soft glow of a private entrance, the kind reserved for those who did not need to wait, and the driver stepped out quietly, opening the door with practiced ease as the city's distant noise faded into something far less significant than it had been just an hour ago, and Clara stepped out, her heels meeting the pavement with a steady, grounded rhythm that no longer carried hesitation, only presence. The building rose above them in clean lines of glass and steel, its lobby illuminated with a warm, understated elegance that did not need to impress, only to exist, and as she crossed the threshold, Clara felt the shift again, not in the space itself, but in how she moved through it, no longer adjusting, no longer anticipating judgment, simply existing within it as if she had always belonged. The concierge nodded in quiet recognition, his greeting directed first to Alexander, then to her with equal respect, and that small detail did not escape her, not because she needed validation, but because she remembered a time when respect had always felt conditional, tied to someone else's presence, someone else's name. They moved toward the elevators, the soft chime echoing as the doors opened, and inside, the mirrored walls reflected them back in still frames, two figures standing side by side, composed, aligned, and Clara caught a glimpse of herself, not searching, not questioning, simply observing, the woman in the reflection no longer carrying the weight of someone else's expectations. Alexander pressed the button for the upper floor, his movements efficient, unspoken, and the elevator began its ascent, smooth and silent, the numbers climbing in steady increments that felt almost symbolic. Though Clara did not dwell on it, she did not need metaphors anymore to understand where she was. "You do not look surprised," he said after a moment, his voice low, almost thoughtful, and Clara turned her head slightly, meeting his reflection before his eyes, her expression calm. "About what?" she asked, though she already knew. "About him losing control of the room," Alexander clarified, his tone neutral, not probing, simply observing. Clara held his gaze for a second, then let it drift, her eyes returning to her own reflection, studying it not with doubt, but with recognition. "He did not lose control tonight," she said quietly, and there was no sharpness in her voice, only clarity. "He just realized he never had it in the way he thought." The elevator continued upward, the soft hum filling the space between them, and Alexander considered her words without interrupting, without reshaping them, allowing them to exist exactly as they were. "And you?" he asked after a brief pause, "did you gain anything from it?" Clara exhaled slowly, not out of exhaustion, but as if releasing something that had been waiting to leave, her shoulders settling, her posture unchanged yet somehow lighter. "I stopped measuring myself against someone who no longer matters," she said, and the truth of it landed without effort, without weight, as if it had been waiting for her to say it out loud. The elevator doors opened with a soft tone, revealing a quiet corridor lined with muted tones and soft lighting, the kind of space designed for privacy, for distance from everything below, and as they stepped out, Clara felt no need to rush forward, no need to linger, simply moving at a pace that felt entirely her own. Alexander walked beside her, not ahead, not guiding, just present, and when they reached the door to the suite, he paused briefly, his hand resting against the handle before glancing at her, not asking permission, but acknowledging her presence in a way that felt deliberate. Clara met his gaze, her expression steady, and gave the slightest nod, not because she needed to agree, but because she chose to. The door opened into a space of quiet luxury, floor-to-ceiling windows revealing the city stretched out below, light scattered like distant constellations, and Clara stepped inside, the air still, calm, untouched by anything that had come before. She moved toward the window, her reflection merging with the skyline for a moment, and as she looked out, there was no pull to what was behind her, no echo of the dinner, no lingering question of what Daniel might be thinking or doing, because that version of her life had already closed without needing a final word. Behind her, Alexander remained where he was for a second, watching her not with curiosity, not with expectation, but with a quiet understanding that did not need to be spoken, and in that silence, Clara realized something she had not fully named before, something that had been forming through every step of the evening. She had not walked away from Daniel tonight. She had walked fully into herself. The city stretched endlessly beyond the glass, a quiet constellation of light suspended in the dark, and Clara stood there for a long moment without moving, her reflection layered faintly over the skyline, no longer searching for meaning in it, no longer trying to interpret what any of it said about her, because for the first time, it did not need to say anything at all. Behind her, the soft click of the door closing settled into the room like a final punctuation mark, sealing the night away from everything that had happened before, and the silence that followed was not empty, it was complete, the kind of silence that does not ask for anything, does not expect anything, it simply exists. Clara let out a slow breath, her shoulders lowering just slightly, the last trace of tension dissolving not into exhaustion, but into something steadier, something quieter, and she became aware of the small details around her, the faint hum of the city below, the soft texture of the carpet beneath her feet, the subtle scent of clean linen in the air, grounding her in the present in a way that felt almost unfamiliar. "You do not look like someone who just won anything," Alexander said from across the room, his voice low, thoughtful, not questioning, not probing, simply observing what was there and what was not. Clara did not turn right away, her gaze still resting on the horizon, her voice calm when she finally spoke. "That is because I did not win," she replied, and there was no hesitation in it, no uncertainty, just truth, simple and unadorned. She turned then, slowly, her eyes meeting his, steady, clear. "Winning would mean there was something to fight over," she added, and the words settled into the space between them with a quiet weight. That did not need emphasis. Alexander studied her for a moment, not evaluating, not analyzing, simply understanding, and there was a faint shift in his expression, something almost imperceptible, a recognition of the distance she had crossed without needing anyone to carry her. "And there is not," he said, more statement than question. Clara shook her head once, a small movement, but final. "There has not been for a long time," she said, and as she spoke, she realized how true it was, how long she had carried something that had already ended, how much of her life had been shaped by a version of herself that no longer existed. She moved away from the window then, her steps unhurried, her posture relaxed, as if the room belonged to her in the same quiet way everything else now did, not because she claimed it, but because she no longer felt the need to question her place within it. She reached the small table near the center of the room, her fingers brushing lightly against its surface, grounding herself again, not out of necessity, but out of awareness, and she let out a small breath, almost a release. "I thought I would feel something different tonight," she admitted, her voice softer now, not fragile, but reflective, closure, maybe, or relief. She paused, considering the word, then gave a faint, almost amused shake of her head. But it was not that. Alexander stepped a little closer, not intruding, not pressing, simply narrowing the distance enough to be part of the moment. "What was it then?" he asked, and his tone held no expectation, only space for her answer. Clara met his gaze again, and this time there was something warmer in her expression, not directed at him alone, but at the understanding itself. "It was quiet," she said, and the word lingered, simple, but filled with everything she had not said. No anger, no need to respond, no need to prove anything. She let that settle, feeling it fully, naming it for the first time. Just quiet. The room held that word, absorbed it, and in that quiet, Clara realized something else, something that had been there all along but had never been clear enough to name. She had spent years thinking strength meant enduring, then proving, then rising above, but tonight had shown her something different, something simpler, and far more powerful. Strength was no longer needing the moment at all. Alexander gave a small nod, not as agreement, but as acknowledgement, and for a brief second, neither of them spoke, because nothing needed to be added to what had already been understood. Clara turned slightly, her gaze drifting back to the window, but this time it was not to look back, not to measure distance, it was simply to exist in the space she had created for herself, and as the city lights shimmered below, she did not see the past reflected in them anymore, she saw only what was ahead, open, unclaimed, and entirely her own. The quiet did not fade, it deepened, settling into the space like something that had finally found where it belonged, and Clara remained near the window, her reflection no longer something she studied but something she accepted, her posture relaxed, her breathing even, as if the night had not exhausted her but clarified her, and for the first time in a long while, there was no lingering question waiting beneath the surface of her thoughts. Alexander moved across the room with the same measured ease he carried everywhere, pouring a glass of water and setting it down within her reach without drawing attention to the gesture, a small act that did not ask for acknowledgement, and she noticed it anyway, not because it impressed her, but because it contrasted so sharply with everything she had once known, where every action had carried expectation, where every kindness had been followed by a condition. She turned slightly, her gaze softening just enough to reflect that awareness, and though she did not thank him out loud, the silence between them carried the understanding clearly enough. "He will try to explain it to himself," Alexander said after a moment, his tone thoughtful rather than dismissive, as if you were considering Daniel not as a rival, but as a pattern, something predictable, something already understood. Clara tilted her head slightly, not disagreeing, not engaging emotionally, simply acknowledging the observation. "He always does," she replied, her voice calm, almost distant, not from indifference, but from clarity. "He will say it was timing, or circumstance, or something he could not have known." She paused, her eyes drifting briefly toward the city again, not searching, just tracing the outline of what was in front of her. "He will never say it. Was because he never really saw me." The words did not carry pain anymore, only truth, stripped of everything that once made it heavy, and Alexander did not interrupt, did not soften it, because it did not need to be softened. "And does that matter?" he asked, and the question was not rhetorical, it was genuine, offered without expectation, leaving space for whatever answer came. Clara considered it for a moment, not because she was unsure, but because she was measuring it against something deeper than habit, something that required honesty without performance. "It used to," she said quietly, her gaze steady, her expression unchanged, "it used to matter more than anything." She let the admission settle, not as a confession, but as a marker of distance, something that belonged entirely to the past. "But it does not anymore." The simplicity of it held, unshaken, and in that moment, the absence of emotion was not emptiness, it was freedom, the kind that does not need to declare itself to be real. Alexander nodded once, not in agreement, but in recognition, understanding that what she was saying was not about Daniel at all, it was about her, about where she now stood in relation to everything that had once defined her. Clara moved away from the window again, her steps unhurried, her movements precise without being controlled, and she sat down on the edge of the sofa, her hands resting loosely in her lap, her posture relaxed in a way that would have been unfamiliar to her before, when stillness had always felt like vulnerability. "For a long time, I thought strength meant becoming someone he could not dismiss," she said, her voice steady, her gaze lifting to meet Alexander's again, someone more successful, more visible, more undeniable. She allowed herself the faintest pause, not for effect, but because she was recognizing the shift as she spoke it. "But tonight showed me something else." The room held her words, quiet, attentive, and she did not rush to fill it. "It showed me that I do not need to be undeniable to him," she continued, "I just needed to stop needing him to understand me at all." The realization did not arrive with force, it arrived with certainty, and that certainty settled into her like something permanent, something that would not unravel with time. Alexander leaned back slightly, his expression unchanged, but there was a subtle shift in his eyes, a deeper acknowledgement of the distance she had crossed on her own, without guidance, without permission, without needing anyone to confirm it for her. "That is not something most people reach," he said, and his voice carried no exaggeration, only fact. Clara gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of her head, not dismissing it, but reframing it. "It is not something most people are forced to learn," she replied, and there was no bitterness in it, only perspective, the kind that comes from having lived through something and come out of it without needing to carry it forward. The silence returned again, but it was different now, not reflective, not transitional, simply present, and Clara leaned back slightly, her shoulders resting against the sofa, her gaze drifting once more toward the city, but this time it did not feel like something outside of her, it felt aligned with her, expansive, open, uncontained. Somewhere far below, a car horn sounded briefly, then faded, and the world continued as it always did, indifferent to what had shifted in that room, but Clara knew, with a clarity that did not need reinforcement, that something had changed in a way that would not reverse. She had not just let go of Daniel. She had let go of the version of herself that ever needed him to matter. The night stretched forward without interruption, the city light steady beyond the glass, and Clara remained where she was, not because she needed to stay still, but because for the first time in years, stillness did not feel like waiting, it felt like arrival, and she let that settle into her, fully, without questioning it, without trying to name it beyond what it already was. Alexander moved quietly across the room, removing his jacket and setting it aside with the same unhurried precision that seemed to define everything he did, and the space between them remained easy, unforced, a presence rather than an expectation, and Clara realized that this, too, was part of what had changed, not just the absence of Daniel, but the absence of pressure, of performance, of needing to anticipate what came next. "He will reach out," Alexander said after a moment, his voice low, steady, as if he were stating something inevitable rather than speculative, and Clara did not react immediately, not because she had not considered it, but because the thought did not carry the weight it once would have. "Yes," she said simply, her tone calm, her gaze still resting somewhere beyond the window, beyond the city, beyond anything that required her attention. "He will." There was no tension in her voice, no trace of anticipation or dread, only acknowledgement, the kind that does not invite further emotion. Alexander studied her for a second, not searching for a reaction, but confirming the absence of one, and he seemed to accept it without question. "And what will you do?" he asked, the question open, neutral, not guiding her toward any answer. Clara let out a quiet breath, her fingers brushing lightly against the fabric of the sofa, grounding herself not because she needed to, but because it had become instinct, a small connection to the present moment. "Nothing," she replied, and the words settled into the room with a certainty that did not need elaboration. She turned her head slightly then, her eyes meeting his, clear, steady. There is nothing left to respond to. The simplicity of it held, unshaken, and Alexander gave a small nod, not in approval, but in understanding, recognizing that this was not avoidance, not denial, but completion. Clara leaned back fully now, her shoulders resting against the sofa, her posture open, unguarded, and she allowed herself to feel the absence of everything that used to define her interactions with Daniel, the tension, the need to explain, the constant recalibration of herself to fit within his perception, and what replaced it was not emptiness, but space, quiet, steady space that belonged entirely to her. "For a long time, I thought closure meant a final conversation," she said, her voice softer now, reflective but not heavy, something where everything would be said, everything understood. She paused, her gaze drifting briefly before returning, not searching, just remembering. "But closure is not something you are given," she continued, "it is something you stop needing." The words did not echo, they settled, final, and Alexander remained silent, allowing them to exist without interruption, because they did not require agreement, they required only acknowledgement. Clara let that silence stretch, not uncomfortable, not uncertain, simply present, and then she shifted slightly, her gaze returning to the window one last time, the city no longer something distant, but something she moved within, something she belonged to without. Question. "He will think tonight was about proving him wrong," she added quietly, almost as an afterthought, and there was the faintest hint of something like irony in her tone, though it never became a smile. "But it was never about that." She turned her head again, her expression unchanged, her voice steady. "It was about me no longer needing him to be wrong in order for me to be right." The distinction was subtle, but absolute, and as it settled into the space between them, it marked something final, something that would not shift with time or circumstance. Alexander held her gaze for a moment longer, then inclined his head slightly, not as agreement, but as recognition of something that had completed itself without needing validation. Outside, the city continued as it always did, lights flickering, distant movement unfolding, and inside the room, nothing else needed to happen, nothing else needed to be said, because everything that had once demanded resolution had already been left behind, not through confrontation, not through victory, but through the quiet, undeniable fact that Clara Whitmore had moved beyond it entirely. Morning arrived without urgency, the soft gray light of early day filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows, replacing the city's glitter with something quieter, more honest, and Clara stood there again, not out of habit, but because the stillness of the space felt different in daylight, less dramatic, more real, and she noticed how nothing from the night before clung to her, not the tension, not the confrontation, not even the memory of Daniel's voice, as if the entire encounter had already settled into something distant, something resolved. The room carried a faint warmth now, sunlight catching the edges of glass and polished surfaces, and Clara wrapped her fingers loosely around a cup of coffee, the heat steady against her palms, grounding her in the present without effort, without intention, and she realized that this, too, was new, the absence of lingering emotion, the absence of replaying what had been said or unsaid, because there was nothing left to analyze. Across the room, Alexander stood near the table, reviewing something on his phone, his posture relaxed, composed, as if the night before had been no more than a brief interruption in a much larger rhythm, and when he looked up, his gaze met hers without question, without needing to ask how she was, because the answer was already there, visible in the way she held herself, in the absence of anything unsettled. He called, Alexander said, his voice even, placing the information between them without weight, without emphasis, as if it were simply another fact in a sequence of events. Clara did not react immediately, not because she was surprised, but because the information did not require a reaction, it did not demand space in her thoughts the way it once would have. She took a small sip of her coffee, the warmth spreading slowly, evenly, and then she nodded once. Of course he did, she replied, her tone calm, neutral, untouched by curiosity or concern. Alexander watched her for a moment, not searching for more, but confirming what was not there, the absence of tension, of hesitation, and he seemed to accept it without question. He wants to meet, he added, not pushing, not suggesting, simply completing the information. Clara let the word settle, not as an invitation, not as an opportunity, but as something already answered before it had been asked, and she set the cup down gently on the table beside her, her fingers releasing it without resistance. No, she said, and the word was soft, but absolute, not defensive, not reactive, simply final. The room held that word without challenge, without needing further explanation, and Clara felt no need to expand on it, because there was nothing to justify, nothing to clarify, nothing to revisit. She moved away from the window then, her steps slow, unhurried, crossing the space with the same quiet confidence she had carried the night before, but now it was different, not sharpened by confrontation, not defined by contrast, simply present on its own. He will not understand that answer, Alexander said, his tone thoughtful rather than critical, and Clara allowed herself the faintest hint of a smile, not directed at him, but at the familiarity of the truth. He does not need to, she replied, and there was no sharpness in it, only clarity, the kind that no longer depends on being shared. She paused briefly near the table, her gaze drifting over the room, taking in the details without attaching meaning to them, because for once, everything simply was, without needing to represent anything else. Understanding was always his condition, she continued quietly, if he could not explain something, he dismissed it. She lifted her eyes again, steady, certain. I am not something he gets to explain anymore. The statement settled into the space with a quiet finality, not dramatic, not forceful, but complete, and Alexander gave a small nod, not in agreement, but in recognition of the boundary she had drawn, one that did not need to be defended because it was no longer under threat. Clara picked up her bag from the chair beside her, the motion simple, deliberate, and she moved toward the door, not because she was leaving something behind, but because she was continuing forward, the night already integrated into something larger, something that did not need to be revisited. As her hand reached for the handle, she paused for just a fraction of a second, not in hesitation, but in awareness, a quiet acknowledgement of the distance she had crossed, and then she opened the door, stepping into the hallway without looking back, because there was nothing behind her that required one last glance. He had reached out. And for the first time, it changed nothing. The hallway outside the suite was quiet in a way that felt intentional, the kind of quiet that existed in spaces where nothing needed to be proven, and Clara walked through it with a steady, unhurried pace, her heels soft against the carpet, her posture relaxed, not because she was trying to appear composed, but because she simply was, and that distinction had changed everything. The elevator doors opened with a gentle chime, and she stepped inside alone this time, her reflection returning in the mirrored walls, but she did not study it, did not search for confirmation or reassurance, because there was nothing left to confirm, nothing left to question. The descent was smooth, silent, the numbers lowering one by one, and with each floor, there was no sense of leaving something behind, only a quiet continuation forward, as if the past no longer followed her downward, no longer lingered in the spaces she moved through. When the doors opened to the lobby, the morning light had fully settled in, warm and even, illuminating the marble floors and glass surfaces without the artificial glow of the night before, and Clara stepped out into it without hesitation, her gaze steady, her movement fluid, as though this space, like every other now, required no adjustment from her. The concierge greeted her with the same respectful nod, his tone unchanged, but she noticed the difference in herself, the way she received it without measuring it, without attaching meaning to it, simply acknowledging it and continuing forward. Outside, the air was crisp, carrying the distant rhythm of the city waking into its day, cars passing, voices blending into a low hum of motion, and Clara inhaled deeply, the air filling her lungs with a clarity that felt almost grounding, almost anchoring, and for a brief moment, she closed her eyes, not to escape, but to fully feel the absence of everything that had once occupied her thoughts. Her phone remained silent in her hand, though she knew it would not stay that way. She knew Daniel would try again, another message, another attempt to reshape the narrative in a way that allowed him to understand it, to contain it, but the thought did not pull at her, did not create tension, it simply existed and then passed, like everything else that no longer held weight. She began to walk, not toward anything urgent, not toward anything defined, just forward, her step steady, her direction her own, and as she moved through the morning light, she noticed the small details that had once been drowned out by louder thoughts, the reflection of sunlight on passing windows, the rhythm of footsteps around her, the quiet presence of a city that did not pause for anyone, and for the first time, she felt fully part of it, not as someone trying to keep up, not as someone trying to prove she belonged, but simply as someone who did. Somewhere behind her, far enough to no longer matter, Daniel Hayes was likely trying to reconstruct the night, trying to find a version of events where he still held control, still held understanding, but Clara did not need to imagine it, did not need to confirm it, because whatever story he told himself would not reach her, would not alter what had already become clear. She paused briefly at the corner, the crosswalk signal changing, the light shifting from red to green, and as she stepped forward with the rest of the city, there was no hesitation, no second thought, only motion, simple and certain. The past had not been defeated. It had simply been outgrown. And as Clara Whitmore moved forward into the day, there was nothing left behind that could follow her anymore. The city carried on around her with quiet indifference, the steady rhythm of morning unfolding in measured steps, and Clara moved within it without resistance, her pace unhurried, her presence unburdened, as if she had finally stepped into a version of herself that required no adjustment, no translation, no explanation. The sunlight caught in the glass of nearby buildings, scattering reflections across the sidewalk, and for a moment, she noticed how different everything felt, not because the world had changed, but because she no longer viewed it through the lens of something she had lost. Her phone vibrated once in her hand, a soft, almost polite interruption, and she glanced down at the screen, Daniel's name appearing exactly as expected, exactly as predicted, his persistence as familiar as it was irrelevant. The message preview lingered for a second, unread, unacknowledged, and Clara felt no pull toward it, no curiosity, no obligation, only the quiet recognition of something that no longer belonged to her. She did not open it. Instead, she let the screen fade back to black, her grip loosening slightly as she slipped the phone into her bag, the action simple, effortless, final in a way that required no declaration. Around her, people moved in intersecting paths, conversations blending into the low hum of a city fully awake, and Clara continued forward, her steps aligned with nothing but her own direction, her own rhythm, and for the first time, that was enough. She passed a storefront window, her reflection catching her eye for just a brief second, and she did not pause, did not analyze what she saw, because there was nothing left to question, nothing left to compare against what had been, only the quiet certainty of what was. Somewhere behind her, in a version of the story that no longer included her, Daniel would try again, another message, another attempt to frame the night in a way that restored his understanding, but Clara no longer existed in that frame, no longer occupied the space where his explanations could reach her, and that distance was not created by anger or rejection, it was created by completion. She reached the corner of the block, the crosswalk signal shifting again, the light turning in her favor without hesitation, and as she stepped forward, there was no pause, no glance back, only movement, steady and certain. The memory of the dinner had already softened into something without edges, something that no longer demanded attention, and even the image of him, of the room, of the words that had once been meant to diminish her, felt distant, like a story she had heard long ago and no longer needed to revisit. She continued down the street, the city opening up ahead of her, each step carrying her further into something that was entirely her own, something unshared, undefined by anyone else's perception, and as she moved, she realized that what she felt was not victory, not relief, not even closure in the way she had once imagined it, it was something quieter, something far more enduring. It was peace. Not the kind that comes after a battle, but the kind that exists when there is no battle left to fight. The kind that does not need to prove itself to be real. Her phone remained silent now, or perhaps it did not, perhaps it continued to vibrate with messages she would never read, but it no longer mattered, because the only response that had ever been necessary had already been given, not in words, not in confrontation, but in the simple, undeniable act of moving forward without looking back. And as Clara Whitmore disappeared into the flow of the city, there was nothing left behind that could follow her, nothing left unresolved, nothing left undone, only the quiet truth that had been there all along, waiting to be lived. He had no idea. But she did.